Welcome back to One Piece Explained. Every new chapter of the Egghead arc continues to make its claim for the best chapter, and 11-10 might really be the end-all be-all. In this breakdown, I'll be talking about just what exactly each of the 5 Elders are, why Brook is looking to be one of the most valuable crew members in this fight against the Elders, why a sandworm might be the most important inclusion in the story since we first saw aliens, and much more. And I want to get into it as soon as possible, so real quick, just subscribe, like, do the thing, you know how YouTube works. Alright, let's get into it. We pick back up from last week and learned that this cover story is actually going to be focusing on Yamato as they travel across Wano, just like Oden did. Now, across the past year or so, many of us had been speculating that we would get a cover story like this at some point, allowing us to check back in on the various characters that we grew attached to over the Wano arc. Perhaps Yamato will also take notes in a journal, just like Oden did, and we'll see them as captions in the cover story. One thing of note, Yamato is once again referred to as the Child of Ogres here. We first got this notion during the Yamato flashback when they were referred to as the Ogre Princess, and in the following chapter in the present day, Kaido had referred to Yamato as the Child of Ogres. This has led to a divide across the fandom, with some believing Kaido to be speaking literally here, while others think it's only a figurative statement. Personally, at this point, I think this is more of a figurative thing, if anything, considering that it has not been expounded upon in any real way. Kaido was trying to further the divide between Yamato and the people of Wano, and this was a means of likening Yamato to himself as a monstrous being who cannot relate to humans. Not only that, as far as we know, Big Mom doesn't have any ogres or oni in her domain. When she spoke of the 3 races she was missing, the ogre race was not included. She lacked the giants, the Lunarians, and a mysterious 3rd race lost to history that we can now understand to be the Buccaneers. Anyways, I'm excited to see what comes of this cover story, as there are a lot of people to check back in on. Now, on to chapter 11-10, Starfall. 4 huge bolts of lightning descend upon the island, just as we saw in the previous chapter, while the various marines around Egghead are left in complete shock. We get a quick montage of the giants around the island as they continue destroying marine ships. There's this really cool shot of a giant shooting the arrow alongside a pacifista firing its laser, and the destructive force here reminds me a lot of the hockey-infused arrows that we saw used by the Kuja tribe. Dorry and Brogy also advance toward the center of the Fabio phase with some giant pirates behind them. Now, you know I'm always on the lookout to see if we've seen any of these guys before, and I think we've seen almost all of the giants portrayed on this page. The giant with the striped shirt shooting the bow and arrow may be the giant celebrating behind Dorry, as we saw during the brief flashback on Little Garden. The helmet, hair, and shirt are all nearly identical. Besides him in the present day could be the shirtless giant we saw in the flashback, given their body shape and particular nose. Now, behind Dorry and Brogy in this chapter, we see a giant with dark messy hair that reminded me a lot of the guy flexing behind Brogy in that Little Garden flashback. And besides that guy in the present day is a bearded giant with a pronounced nose. This could very well be one of the giant warrior pirates that we had seen captured by the Marines during the Big Mom flashback. The nose, beard, and helmet shape are pretty spot on. If these do all indeed match up, then we're getting pretty close to having seen all of the giant warrior pirates that we saw in that one flashback, as I talked about other potential matches over the last few manga breakdowns. I'm curious to see if we'll get these 2 fellas here again, the one on the right potentially being the Raiden that we saw during Big Mom's flashback. Now, over in the Hall of Power at Mary Joie, we see one large summoning circle where the Elders once stood, with nothing but a visual transponder snail projecting Vegapunk's broadcast. We've seen the 5 Elders use transponder snails across the series, with the first instance being this regular snail decorated with stars. More recently, we actually saw a snail take the likeness of Saturn during the Kuma flashback, and with that, when I saw this visual transponder snail in the Hall of Power, I at first thought it was taking the likeness of Warcury, given the similar mustache. And while this could be the case, it's important to consider that the big projector snails we've seen throughout the series are often featured with some sort of mustache, regardless of whose likeness it is that they're mimicking. And as such, this could just mean that this particular snail with the thick white mustache is very old, which may even play into the idea of the 5 Elders having extended lifespans. Also, a really good bit is going on here with the Vegapunks, as in the previous chapter, with 9.5 minutes remaining, Vegapunk suggested inventing something to pass the time and wanted some coffee, but realizing coffee would take more than 10 minutes to make, he instead just decided to invent instant coffee within the span of a couple minutes. And of note, between page 5 of the last chapter and page 3 of this chapter, only 2.5 minutes have passed, leaving us with 7 more minutes until Vegapunk's big reveal. Speaking of, there are some huge reveals taking place right now as we see shadowy figures begin to appear in the 4 pentagrams surrounding Saturn. Now, if you'll notice, while this is very much like how Saturn arrived on the island, there is a key difference here, as the Elders appear to be almost materializing from the Black Lightning, as opposed to Saturn, who simply emerged from the circle itself. Saturn's summoning featured much smaller instances of Black Lightning that spread from the ground outwards, whereas within these last 2 chapters, it's almost as if the lightning may have crashed down from the sky. It's not a huge detail, but it may work to hint more toward how this ability exactly works. Saturn was the one who was tasked with initiating the summoning, suggesting that this may be something only he can can do, and as such, perhaps it takes more energy or even haki to summon the other elders from afar. Now, if you look closely at the circles on the page, you can make out the number 4 on the one closest to us, and the one behind that seems to have the number 3. Presumably, the one next to it is the number 2, and the one next to that is number 1. Earlier, we saw Saturn's circle feature the number 5. Taking this in consideration with the order in which the monsters are formally named in this chapter, it seems Saturn is number 5, Mars is number 4, Warcury is number 3, Nusjuro is number 2, and Jupiter is number 1. And if you go back and check across their several appearances in the series, this is often the order in which they're presented. Now, before your power scaling brain kicks in, this numbering of the elders could mean a variety of things. Though, given that Jupiter looks to be the youngest one in the group, it makes me wonder if this is supposed to be their ranking by age or length of tenure or something like that, with Saturn being the oldest and Jupiter being the newest. On the other hand, this could actually mean the reverse is true if the Op Fruit's perennial youth operation is in play. Perhaps Jupiter was the first to receive it, explaining why he looks so young. Meanwhile, the rest of the elders had to wait to get the operation done over the decades while the world government sought after the fruit. Now, we get some formal Oda boxes to go along with the reveal, and some things stand out. First and foremost, we're not at all told what the devil fruit these guys have are. Instead, Oda simply refers to them as the monsters they appear to be. There has long been speculation that the elders are not normal devil fruit users and perhaps instead literal devils or demons themselves, and this definitely supports that line of thinking. But even so, it's difficult to say for sure, especially given that they all bear the black Hagoromo that we've seen associated with Zoan awakenings such as Lucci and Kaku. Furthermore, these are not the regular Oda boxes that we've seen Oda use to introduce characters across the series. We actually got those when the 5 elders were formerly named earlier in this arc. Instead, these are actually styled like the ones Oda used across Wano, and I take this to be fairly significant as the 5 elders are seemingly inspired by various yokai and Japanese mythology. Well, almost all of them, and we'll get to that in just a bit. So it does seem to me that there might be something greater going on here, as we know there is something very special about Wano in the story. So with that all said, let's actually talk about the 5 elders. In our first full double-page spread since the formation of the Grand Fleet at the end of Dressrosa, we get the full reveal of the 5 elders in what appears to be their monstrous Zoan forms. Oda's been packing so much onto every single page for so long that it's almost been a decade since he last drew a full double-page spread with no other panels, and it makes complete sense here, as there likely was no other way to fit these giant monsters in. You'll notice that Luffy at this point has returned to his regular size, as he's once again small before Saturn. But what exactly are these creatures? Well, as many suspected, Saint J. Garcia Saturn is indeed a Gyuki or Uchioni, a spider-like yokai with the head of an ox. Now, we've seen his capabilities throughout the last several chapters, from his eye-related force powers to his venom-coated limbs that can stretch, and it's currently unclear if his regenerative abilities are specific to him or if all the elders have it in some form. One thing you'll notice though from this spread is that Saturn seems to be the only one who maintains some of his human form's likeness in his presumed Zoan form, at least to this extent, with several of his features being preserved. We then have Saint Marcus Mars, who appears to be an Itsumade, a sort of bird yokai with a snake-like body and the face of a man, though here it only seems to retain Mars's long hair. Itsumade is a phrase roughly meaning until when, as there are some records stating that they would hang around corpses and repeat the phrase, asking how long the corpse would be left there. Of note, Mars seems to have the unique ability among the 5 elders to fly, as we later see him soar towards the Labo phase and charge right through the Frontier Dome. As a quick refresher, above the 2 lines running around the Labo phase is where the security dome lies as a sort of invisible grid. Should anything or anyone cross that grid, a laser beam is triggered. If the rest of the 5 elders have any sort of durability or regeneration similar to Saturn, then Mars should not have much trouble crossing the barrier here. Then there's Saint Topman Warcury, whose name can be read as Fengji or Hoki in some translations. Now, this is not necessarily a yokai, instead being a monster from Chinese legend. The Fengji is a giant violent boar with incredible strength, and there are also some accounts that state that it had 2 heads. Now, we don't actually get to see Warcury in action in this chapter at all, but there are some interesting things about his design. His mustache as a human somewhat resembles the tusks that he has in this monster's form. Actually, he seems to have 2 sets of tusks entirely, perhaps as a nod to the 2-headed boar myth. You'll also notice that his skin along with the tusks are patterned with a sort of similar condition that he has on his forehead in his human form. In this arc, we learned about Sapphire Scale and how it may have been around for a very long time, making some believe that Warcury had been scarred by it at some point. Whatever the case may be, I'm excited to see more from him in the next chapter. Now, Saint Ethan Baron Nusjuro resembles a yokai known as the Bakotsu, a spirit of a horse who is said to be burnt to death. Now, Nusjuro has already been one of the most interesting members of the Five Elders, given his appearance, his sword, and his name being very reminiscent of the names of Wano, but this chapter really takes it up a notch. His monstrous form appears to be a huge skeletal horse, bearing the remnants of some tattered cloth across his head and body. But what's more interesting is Nusjuro seems to have some sort of hybrid form that preserves his human appearance from the waist up, effectively making him a centaur. And when he does this, his gi or keikoki that he wears looks to merge with the cloth that is laid on the back of his full Zoan form. Not only that, he is still the size of that large horse, towering over even the Pacifista, who are over 20 feet or nearly 7 meters tall. This altogether would make for a very interesting hybrid transformation, as even Saturn's presumed hybrid form showcased some more overlap between his human and Zoan features. Instead, this is very reminiscent of Black Maria's modified hybrid form, where she was more of a centaur-like being with the upper half of her body preserved. It's possible that the Elders engaged in some sort of devil fruit modifications like she did. However, there's also some precedence for mythical Zoans utilizing partial transformations, as we've seen with Marco across the series, who can choose to transform only certain parts of his body. Whatever this may be, it's incredibly cool, and it doesn't stop here. Nusjuro looks to have incredible speed, running across the coast of the island in just a few moments, while immobilizing the Pacifista that were proving to be an issue for the Marines. He does this by using his sword, long speculated to be the Shodai Kitetsu, the first and highest ranked cursed sword of the Kitetsu lineage, based on its hilt matching the appearance of the others. Now, there's been a lot of talk about whether Nusjuro's sword is a black blade or not. In its prior appearances in the series, it's been portrayed as a normal blade, but here in this chapter you can see that it's fully coated black. It could be that Nusjuro is just applying haki to it, or perhaps it's being retconned to be a true black blade. We'll just have to see. Nusjuro is also able to freeze parts of the Pacifista, rendering them unable to function, and this is extremely reminiscent of Brook's capabilities thanks to his Soul Fruit. Throughout the post-time skip, we've seen Brook utilize this chill of the underworld to freeze his enemies, and for the longest time, people have been matching Zoro up against Nusjuro because of the sword connection, but could we actually be seeing Brook set up as a key player against him? I had speculated in my chapter 1094 breakdown that Brook may prove extremely useful against Saturn and the demonic forces that are the Five Elders, so check that out if you're interested for more. And I'm excited to see that idea potentially coming back into play and coming to fruition with this chapter. There are a ton of similarities at hand, with both of them having death-related freezing abilities, and Nusjuro being a skeleton horse, while Brook is a skeleton whose identity animal was said to be a horse. And last but not least, we have Saint Shepherd Jupiter, who is not any sort of yokai or Eastern mythological creature, but instead a sandworm. And I know some people may not be impressed by this or feel a bit disappointed, but I genuinely think this is the most interesting one. First, I just want to address that some potential misconceptions might be at play. This is a sandworm spelled with an O, not a Y or a U. I've seen some scanslations use the Y spelling, and I think that's a big liberty to take considering that worms with a Y are more related to dragons and serpents, and so far we have not seen any indication that this is supposed to represent that. Instead, Jupiter's Zoan form seems to have been inspired by the Western fictional creatures popularized by the science fiction novels like Dune, and the recent movies as well. Because of this, its name was not written in kanji or traditional Chinese like the rest of the Elders, but instead in katakana, the syllabary used to convey foreign words. Now, why would Oda go out of his way to have 4 of the Elders be Eastern mythical creatures tied to ancient history, and have one of them be a relatively more modern monster from science fiction? It's hard to say for sure, but there are a few possibilities. For one, this could further us into the realm of space. So far, we've had space pirates and aliens, and more recently we've seen characters acknowledge that the notion of space monsters actually exist in this very arc. Now, holding on to this for a moment, recall the earlier discussed idea of Jupiter having been the first of the 5 Elders to have gained perennial youth. If Jupiter is supposed to be the first among the 5 Elders in some capacity, him being the odd one out with this creature could have implications. We've speculated the 5 Elders to be ancient demons or spirits, but what if the first among them was actually some primordial space creature? From Manel's cover story, we learned that the sky races having descended upon the planet from the moon is a strong possibility, so it's not out of the question that other extraterrestrials settled as well. And after all, we know aliens exist in the world of One Piece, and we've actually seen a giant worm-like being similar to Jupiter in that cover story. I'd like to think that the Elders being this conscious mix of mythical demonic beings and fictional space creatures is Oda's way of bridging these two disparate worlds as one and the same. Similar to how we've learned that the ancient kingdom was actually technologically advanced, perhaps we could see a common origin between science fiction and ancient mythology. Anyways, that's just some speculation and I could be completely off. Either way, I really do enjoy the design of this worm. The giant worm with human teeth is equally hilarious and terrifying, and I also really like how the mouth closes in on itself, forming this X-like shape when it opens up. The orientation of the eye changes from the mouth unraveling. It's sort of like the cootie catchers or paper fortune tellers that you would see as a child. It's a very cool design for how simple it is. Now, if we look back at the silhouettes of the elders that we saw earlier in this arc, we can see that they, for the most part, were fairly close to the true forms of the elders that we see here, with some liberties taken, especially in the facial features. In this chapter, all of their eyes match Saturn's crazed stare that we saw when he first transformed into this mode. We now realize that these are supposed to be Saturn's legs over here, and the giant face on the ground is of course Jupiter's worm form, and besides him is Nusjuro in his hybrid centaur-like state. Much like we had speculated, the ribbon-like structures around both Nusjuro and Mars were indeed Hagoromo's. Speaking of, Mars and Warcury silhouettes were fairly spot on, although we only see one set of tusks on Warcury here. So with all of these silhouettes revealed and done with, the only one remaining is the giant one creeping down from the throne area. There's always been speculation that this is supposed to be Jupiter, since we don't get a good look at him in that panel, but I've always understood him to be the figure between Saturn and Nusjuro, since it bears its own white silhouette to distinguish itself from the other figures. I've seen people maintain that the figure coming from the top is Jupiter's hybrid form, and while anything's possible, I have my doubts. We've seen Imu transform, and when they do, their eyes change and slant similarly to how the Elder's eyes have been portrayed here, just with rings around the crazed pupil. Plus, they bear sharp fangs, while we've seen Jupiter retain its very human-like teeth. Now, even with 5 of the silhouettes revealed, it's still a bit hard to place who is doing what in each of these panels. This devilish tail does not match any of the Elder's forms, which makes me think that it may actually belong to Imu, unless this is supposed to be a dramatized rendition of Saturn's ability to stretch his limbs, but at this point I still doubt it. It could potentially belong to Warcury's monstrous boar form, as the rest of these panels do involve a figure that could line up with his design. Even after all of this, I'm still glad that we have some mysteries to ponder over, and it's still kind of exciting. And with all of the forms revealed, it makes complete sense why Wapol was so traumatized after gazing upon them. While all of this stuff with the 5 elders is going on, we also check back in with the rest of the Straw Hat crew. Sanji's still carrying Vegapunk's body and running presumably toward the other side of the island, and he's the one checking in on all the other groups as he warns the others that the situation has gotten even more dire. We learn that Brook and Lilith have met up with Nami, Usopp, Chopper, Robin, and Edison, and the runaway Thousand Sunny has been stopped thanks to what looks like Usopp's bamboo javelin technique. We first saw this used by him during the Fishman Island arc. Jinbei, on the other hand, is actually finally approaching Zoro and Lucci just before their battle comes to a climax. Funny enough, it's Sanji's harsh words that motivate Zoro to get serious and deliver the final blow, even though Lucci had been using similar taunts against Zoro earlier in this arc. Lucci knocks Zoro's Sandai Kitetsu out of his hand, sending it spiraling into the air, though Zoro remains calm and collected, and this feels like a blatant callback to when he first encountered the sword and tested his luck. Though here, Zoro nonchalantly dodges Lucci's multiple hand pistols, which looks to be a version of the finger pistol spots that we first saw used against Luffy, and we recently saw it used by Who's Who against Jinbei as well. And you'll recall that the regular hand pistol debuted earlier in this arc when Lucci used it against Sentomaru. But Zoro casually catches the Kitetsu and finishes Lucci off with a new hockey-infused iteration of his classic Tiger Hunt technique, aptly named after the leopard he is fighting. It also references one of the 8 levels of Cold Hell in Buddhism, much like Zoro's attacks always do. It is interesting, while Zoro was shown using King of Hell 3-sword style earlier in this fight, he's long since stopped using it. And similarly, Lucci has been shown using armament hockey throughout this arc, but hasn't been seen using it in this battle by this point. Despite what power scalers or agenda havers may believe, it really does seem like this fight was taking a long time for good reason, as both combatants were wearing each other down. Now checking back in with Luffy, Jupiter's monstrous sandworm form appears from beneath and swallows him. This is far from the first time that Luffy's been swallowed by such a creature. Earlier in this arc, Luffy was eaten by the hologram space monster and was also swallowed by Kaido during their fight. There's also of course when he was stuck in Nola back on Skypiea, but more interestingly, he was swallowed whole by a brachiosaur during Little Garden and was saved by the giant Dorry, much like the giant captains do here. This is quite the callback, and Luffy's pose is even pretty much the same, with his legs extended outwards. Now given this pose, I have to wonder if he was getting ready to expand within Jupiter, much like he did when he was stuck inside Kaido. Anyhow, Dorry and Brogy are finally here to fight alongside Luffy, something we've been waiting for so long. I guess we'll get to see if the rest of the elders have regenerative capabilities as well, since Jupiter has been cut in 3 here. Could his various sections simply reconnect, or is there some chance that each part grows the rest of the body back and he ends up multiplying? There's also no break next week, so the answers won't be too far away, I'm sure. Now, if you made it this far into the video, thank you so much for watching. I know there was a lot in this one, but there really was just so much to cover. Let me know in the comments what you're looking forward to and what your favorite part of this chapter was, or if there's anything that I missed that you think is worthwhile. If you're new to the channel or still haven't subscribed, I'd really appreciate it if you do. It helps to support me and grow the channel. Thank you so much for watching. Stay safe, and I hope to see you in the next one.